how do you then get someone who thinks, okay, cool, I'm ready for change. I think I want this disruption. But then how do you actually get them to kind of think through that process of actually making that happen, right? Because there's a lot of organizations that love the advantages of disruption, but don't necessarily want to be disrupted.
Yeah. No, great. Another great question. I think you're right. Every organization feels like they love disruption, they love change, and wants to transform. But then when the rubber meets the proverbial road, they're not, they're not there. So I always start from a place of what's your culture, and you have to start from what is the actual culture of your organization. Because if you're touting yourself as we're a culture of innovation, no red tape, fast paced and fast moving, but you have a 30-step approval process to buy a stapler. Those two things don't match. So really starting with the culture, and asking yourself, do I have the right culture to achieve the transformation or the change that I'm seeking to for the future? Because while it's very cliche and it's an old term, that culture eats strategy for lunch, it is still very, very true. Because if your culture does not match the strategy in which you're trying to incorporate, you will always find yourselves in spaces of resistance and not being able to pull that thing off, and wondering why it's so hard. So being able to truly assess your culture, understand your culture, and see how your culture either aligns and support the initiative in which you're trying to move forward, or what cultural barriers or what cultural artifacts, as I call them, could be acting as barriers that will prohibit you from being able to achieve the things that you want to do. And this is a tough spot for organizations and for leaders, because often enough, when you really talk about and get down to the nitty gritty of your culture, it's not always pretty. It's not always the things in which, especially as you move up into the C-suite in the proverbial top floors of organizations, may not have a line of sight to what's actually happening in that day-to-day environment and what culture is living with the organization. And so really, truly understanding your culture and see if you have any misalignment or alignment or gaps or opportunities to either shore certain things up or really have some tough conversations around certain things, allows you to really build your change plan and your change, your transformation strategy in a much more effective way. And also being able to understand that change does not happen in a linear fashion. One of the things that I've seen, especially over the past, 5 years or so, is that organizations, and especially as we find ourselves in the pandemic and all organizations trying to figure, what do I do? We got to change. We got to do something different. They went out and they said, let's take 5 people and send them to a change management class, and then we'll have these individuals come back and drive all of the change within our organization. So you have individuals coming back, all well-intended, all great in minds, thinking that now that I have this model, that if I follow these steps, each one at a time, then somehow at the end is going to spit out this perfect amount of change. And change is just not, it just doesn't happen that way. And so what I always encourage and advocate for is that change, you can't treat change like grandma's silverware, where you pull out on holidays and for special occasions. So you pull that change book off the shelf once or twice a year and say, oh, let me go through this model and see, have I created awareness? Do I need to do knowledge? And kind of think about it that way, versus how do we incorporate change in our DNA, i.e. the culture of our organization. So we're always thinking about change and transformation in a very fluid way, to where it's just a part of who we are and what we do, and not this thing that we pull off the shelf when we're ready to launch a big initiative or project. And so that's where I really help leaders and organizations get aligned and get really crystal clear on what's going to either propel your transformation or really going to hold you back as you try to do this new thing.
I love how you talked about the ad car model, because that's exactly usually what happens, right? Like, you find your change champions, it's a good maybe 10% of your org, and you're like, now go spread that, right? But then we forget that there is now a new common language that has to be established, right? So when you're talking about awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and then the reinforcement of that, all of that has major implications into making change happen. And it usually starts at the leadership level, right? With the sponsorship of your executives in those spaces. Man, I just took a ton of notes again. Thank you. One of the other questions that popped up in my mind too, as you were talking, Fredrick, it sounded like there's almost this need or reminder that, like, do you trust your people when it comes to your culture, right? Like, and I'm battling this right now with our clients when we talk about kind of the future of work. And do you bring people back into the office versus keeping them at home? What kind of hybrid model does that look like? And then that word fairness comes into play. So there's so many complexities to that. Talk to me a little bit about what it means to trust your people.
Yeah, meaning to trust your people is huge. And one of the things that I often tell leaders to talk to organizations about is the ability to not do what is easy versus doing what is best. And especially as it relates to future of work as an example. So it's easy to say, well, let's just bring everybody back. Let's just bring everybody back, and somehow, some way that's going to fix everything, or something that we don't have to worry about, versus saying, what's the best thing to do at this time? And the best thing to do may be figuring out what this hybrid look like, what does remote look like. But what comes along with that is a high level of intentionality. And that's the missing piece where leaders and organizations often find themselves reverting back to, or wanting to revert back to what the way things were, is because now in this new space, intentionality is that much more important and that much more effective in the things that we have to do. We were having those same conversations around future work, and we would often find ourselves in conversations around, well, we have to bring people back. One of the words that was often tossed around is productivity. How do we know that people are being productive? And I will always say, well, how do our leaders know that their people are being productive today? Because if they're measuring productivity by being able to walk down the hall and seeing Fredrick or Jane in their cube, that's not being productive. That just means being present. And they're not the same. So how do we either redefine, or in a lot of cases define, what productivity is and what that looks like, and also what's the intentionality that we have to have around that? The same way with, we have to have a sense of community, we have to have a sense of culture, and the idea of only being able to create that is by being in person was also a myth that needed to be busted across our organization. Is that culture, and if your culture stems on, well, every morning I see Fredrick in the break room, and over our coffee we have a chat about our weekend. That's not culture. That's a conversation, or other than having the intentionality of saying, how do I ensure that our colleagues and our coworkers are connecting with each other in meaningful ways, whether they're in the office or in other states? That requires a large amount of intentionality.